There is a world out there that runs on different rules than ours. A world where the ocean is alive and sentient and has been quietly making decisions about the fate of civilizations for longer than anyone can fully measure. A world where the mountains remember who first taught humans to move them. Where the moon is not just a light hung in the sky for navigation and romance and the pulling of tides, but a spirit who looked at the physical world and chose it, chose mortality and form and the cold water of a sacred pool, because being present for something that mattered seemed worth giving up the infinite distance of the spirit plane. This is a world built by human hands, specifically by two men who sat in a room and talked and who refused at every single decision point across 6 years of development and production to do things the easy way. Who decided that if you were going to invent a fighting style, it should be based on a real fighting style with a real philosophy behind it, and that the animators who drew it should have reference footage of a real practitioner performing it frame by frame? Who decided that if writing appears in the background of a scene on a wanted poster, or a shop sign, or a decorative scroll, that writing should be real classical Chinese calligraphy, brushed by an actual scholar, regardless of whether any viewer would ever be able to read it? Who decided that a children's cartoon should be built with the same obsessive attention to internal consistency that you would bring to a work of literature? Tonight, we are going very deep into that world. Not the surface of it, not the story arc you already know by heart. We are going into the architecture underneath. The history that the episodes never had time to show you directly. The mythology that lives in the margins, in the transitions, in the things the show knows and chooses not to say aloud. The hidden rules of the world that make everything feel inevitable when you watch the show and impossible to articulate when someone asks you why. Find somewhere comfortable. Let the sound of this voice be the thing you follow into whatever rest tonight wants to give you. If sleep arrives before we reach the end, the world will be here when you come back. It always is. It was built to last. Part 1. The shape of a world before everything went wrong. Before Sozin. Before the comet streaking across a summer sky like a second sun, powering up an already overwhelming military force into something capable of ending civilizations in a single terrible night. Before the 100 years of war that followed, the occupation and the propaganda and the systematic erasure of whole ways of life. Before a 12-year-old boy carrying more weight than any 12-year-old should ever carry, fled into a storm on the back of a flying bison and did not come back. Before all of that, there was a world that worked. A world in balance. 4 nations in relationship, trading, traveling, occasionally fighting in the small, ordinary ways that human communities have always found to fight each other, but fundamentally coexisting. The Avatar moving between them as a living guarantee that no single force would ever be allowed to overwhelm the whole. The elements in their proper proportions: water at the poles, earth in the vast central landmass, fire on the volcanic archipelago to the west, air at the 4 highest and most remote points of the world. A machine of such elegant design that it had maintained itself for thousands of years. It is easy to forget this machine ever existed. Avatar begins inside the wreckage. The Southern Water Tribe, when we first see it, is a scattering of tents and smoke on a field of ice, populated by elderly people and children. All the men away at war, all the waterbenders gone. The Earth Kingdom is under siege in a conflict that has lasted a century. The air nomads are simply absent, their temples empty, their culture surviving only in the memories of one boy who has been asleep for 100 years and wakes up to find that everyone he knew is dead. The Fire Nation is the largest military power in the world, and has been for so long that the alternative feels like history rather than recent loss. But the alternative was recent. The grandmother Katara grew up watching Gran, Kana, who sits mending clothes and telling stories and carrying a betrothal necklace carved by a man she left behind in the north, was born into a world where the balance still held, where both water tribes were functional cultures with living water-bending traditions, where the air temples were full of people and prayer and the sound of wind moving through meditation halls. Kana was born into a world that the next generation would never see, and she carried the knowledge of that world in her body the way the old always carry what the young can only imagine. To understand the war, you have to understand what there was to destroy. The 4 nations before the 100-Year War were not a unified peace. They were not a utopia. Nations never are. But they were genuinely distinct cultures that had found ways to exist alongside each other across centuries of diplomatic contact and occasional conflict. And the structures that made that coexistence possible were real and functional. The Avatar's role was fundamentally mediatory, not a warrior, not a conqueror, but a person uniquely positioned between all four nations who could intercede when things began to tip beyond what ordinary diplomacy could handle. The Avatar was the emergency brake on a machine that usually ran without needing one. The water tribes had a relationship across the poles that the war eventually severed. The northern and southern tribes maintained contact, sent knowledge and people between them, recognized each other as family even across the enormous distance of the globe. The northern city was more elaborate, a network of canals carved from ice, a palace that caught the moonlight and turned the whole settlement into something luminous at night, a waterbending culture so developed that it had formalized itself into distinct schools and traditions. The South was smaller, more nomadic in some ways, but it had its own living tradition of waterbending, its own spiritual practices, its own community of people who drew power from the moon and the sea. The Fire Nation's relationship with the air nomads before the war is perhaps the most surprising and quietly devastating detail in the show's entire pre-war history. There existed in the Fire Nation, in the decades before Sozin began his preparations, a cultural institution called the Fire and Air Center of Learning, a joint establishment built to share air nomad teachings and philosophy with Fire Nation citizens, endorsed by the Fire Nation's nobility and by representatives from all four air temples. Fire Nation families sent their children there. Air nomad teachers crossed the ocean to instruct them. The philosophical exchange was real and valued and ongoing. This detail is one of the most shattering facts in the show's mythology, because it means the genocide was not born from ancient animosity between two cultures that had always been enemies. The Fire Nation did not always fear the air nomads. For a time, a significant time, they admired them. They built a school to study them. The destruction came not from hatred rooted in history, but from ideology curdling in a single generation under a single leader who decided that a philosophy of non-attachment to possessions and territory was incompatible with an empire built entirely on the acquisition of both. Sozin did not burn the air temples because the Fire Nation had always wanted to. He burned them because he had decided that the air nomad's fundamental worldview could not be allowed to exist in a world he was trying to reshape around the opposite principle. You cannot build an empire on willing subjects if the most spiritually respected people in the world are telling those subjects that empires are, philosophically speaking, a profound waste of a life. The Earth Kingdom before the war was the most geographically diverse and culturally varied of the four nations, which is part of what made it so difficult for the Fire Nation to fully conquer, even after a century of trying. The kingdom's identity was built less on a unified cultural vision than on a shared relationship with the earth itself, the solid, unyielding, deeply patient quality of stone that the earthbenders drew from and expressed back into the world through their style of bending. Cities like Omashu and Ba Sing Se operated almost as worlds unto themselves. The foggy swamp in the far west was home to a branch of waterbenders who had wandered so far from the poles that they'd developed an entirely different relationship with waterbending the moisture inside plants, existing in total spiritual communion with a single, enormous banyan grove tree whose roots connected every living thing in their territory. The Fire Nation before Sozin was a culture with genuine artistic and intellectual traditions, with temples that functioned as spiritual rather than administrative centers, with a relationship to fire rooted in something older and more genuine than the weaponized aggression of the war era. Older Fire Nation architecture tells a different story than the industrial gray of the military ships, a story of a culture that once understood fire as something sacred, as warmth and life, rather than as a weapon of conquest. Drop a comment right now with where you are in the world and what time it is where you're watching. There is something that feels right about knowing this reached you, wherever you are, at whatever hour the night finds you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it truly helps. Now, back into the world. Part 2, The Air Nomads, a civilization written in wind. There is a kind of grief that arrives specifically when you try to imagine something that no longer exists in the present tense. When you try to imagine the air nomads as they were not the ruins, not the mythology, not the single surviving representative trying to hold a civilization in his 12-year-old body, you run up against the limits of reconstruction. All the records are gone. The living transmission is severed. What remains is architecture and one boy's memories and the sense, watching him move through the world, that he is carrying something so large it should be impossible for him to walk upright. The air nomads organized themselves around 4 temples positioned at what their geography considered the 4 corners of the world. The northern and southern air temples sat in the Earth Kingdom's northern mountain ranges. The eastern air temple occupied a cluster of islands in the eastern seas. The western air temple hung beneath a cliff overhang, in a formation of rock that turned the architecture itself upside down, buildings clinging to the underside of the cliff like a city defying gravity through will and stone, and the very specific knowledge that if you live among the people who bend air, ordinary structural arrangements are optional. The placement was deliberate in a way that went beyond the practical value of altitude and inaccessibility. The air nomads understood, in the same way that Tibetan Buddhist monks understood, that proximity to the sky was a spiritual as much as a physical condition. The thin air at high altitude produces a quality of attention that lower altitudes don't easily replicate. The distance from ordinary ground-level noise creates a kind of enforced silence that meditation traditions around the world have always sought out and engineered their architecture around. The air nomads built their homes in the most inconvenient places on the planet, not because it was practical, but because inconvenience in this case was the point. But the temples were not hermitages. They were communities full, functioning, multi-generational communities with all the ordinary complexities of community life. They had governance, organized around councils of elders at each temple, with a head monk or head nun responsible for daily decisions. They had schools, where airbending was taught through both formal instruction and an approach to play that was itself a pedagogical philosophy. Learning by doing, learning by moving, learning by discovering through physical experience the principles that the element embodied. They had festivals and traditions, and the kind of accumulated cultural knowledge that only comes from centuries of continuous habitation of the same space. The temples were gendered in their organization. The northern and southern temples were home to the monks, the eastern and western to the nuns. This raises a question the show never fully answers. How did the air nomad community sustain itself across generations if men and women lived at opposite ends of the world? The most consistent implication in the show's mythology is that air nomad children were raised communally, that the concept of individual nuclear family parenthood was less central to their culture than the concept of the entire community as parent. Aang grew up with a community of monks as his family. Monk Gyatso was not his biological father, but was in every functional sense the parent of his emotional life, the person who played with him, who snuck him fruit pies, who taught him airbending not as a discipline to be mastered but as a language to be learned and loved, who looked at this boy who was destined to carry the weight of the world and chose, every single day, to also let him just be a boy. The decision by the Council of Elders to separate Aang from Gyatso to send him to a different temple for more rigorous training befitting an avatar was not malicious. Every member of that council was a person trying, in their limited and well-intentioned way, to do right by the avatar and by the world. They looked at this child prodigy who had somehow become the youngest airbending master in recorded history, and they thought, he needs more structure, more rigor, more of what the role requires, and less of what a beloved teacher's affection offers. What they did not fully account for was the particular terror of being 12 years old and told simultaneously that you are the most important person alive and that the one person who made you feel most loved is being taken from you. Those two pieces of information arriving together produced a response that no well-meaning council could have predicted with confidence. Aang grabbed his sky bison, flew into a storm, and did not come back. If the council had never made that decision, Aang would have been in the temple on the morning of the genocide. He would have died with Monk Gyatso and everyone else. The avatar cycle would have passed to a water avatar, an infant, somewhere in the world, not yet old enough to know what they were, with no one knowing where to find them. There would have been no one to stop Sozin's comet the first time. The war would have continued without an end. The irony is one of those historical facts too painful to look at directly. The Council's act of attempted care was, in the full sweep of history, the thing that preserved the possibility of a different world. Aang carries the guilt of his absence alongside the grief of his loss. Two weights that contradict each other logically, but are both present simultaneously, in the way that trauma never does the person experiencing it, the courtesy of being internally consistent. The airbending forms that define the culture's fighting style and daily practice are based on Baguazhang, a Chinese martial art whose name refers to the 8 trigrams of the I Ching. Baguazhang's defining characteristic is circular movement. The practitioner moves continuously around a central point, using the opponent's own force against them, never staying in one place long enough to be effectively hit. The footwork is distinctive, a kind of spiraling walk around an imaginary center point, the body turning and angling, always maintaining an indirect relationship to any direct attack. This is Aang's relationship with the world throughout the entire series, not just in combat. He approaches almost everything indirectly. He finds the path that doesn't require him to become something he doesn't want to be. He treats engagement as something to be shaped and guided rather than met head-on. And this is not weakness, as certain characters initially read it. It is the most sophisticated response available to a person who understands that direct confrontation destroys things that cannot always be rebuilt. The arrow tattoos that mark every airbending master are not decorative. They follow the chi pathways of the body, the same channels that acupuncture works along, that chi blocking targets, that the chakra system describes in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, that the air nomad spirituality drew from extensively. The arrow on the forehead points to the crown chakra, the seventh energy center, associated in both traditions with cosmic consciousness and the dissolution of the boundary between individual self and universal awareness. The arrows on the arms trace the flow of chi from the hands toward the heart. The arrows on the legs trace the same flow upward from the feet. To receive the tattoos was to be marked as someone whose inner energy moved freely through all of these channels. Not someone who had achieved perfection. The air nomads, like all genuine spiritual traditions, did not believe in perfection as a static destination, but someone who had opened themselves sufficiently to the flow of the element through and around their body that this flow had become natural to them. Aang receives his at 12 years old. The ceremony shown in flashback is warm and bright and full of the specific joy of people celebrating one of their own. And then the scene cuts. The temple, now empty. The wind still moving through the halls, as it always has, but with a different quality now that there is nothing to push against, just stone and sky and the echo of what the laughter used to sound like. Every air nomad was a bender, every single one. This fact is unique in the entire Avatar world, and its implications are staggering. In every other nation, bending was rare, perhaps 1 in 10 people, perhaps fewer. The vast majority of Earth Kingdom citizens had no special relationship with stone. The Fire Nation's military power was concentrated in a relatively small, bending-capable minority. Even the Northern Water Tribe, with its long tradition of waterbending, had far more non-benders than benders. The air nomads had none. The explanation offered in the show is that the air nomads' spiritual practices had, over generations of concentrated development, essentially universalized the capacity. That being born into an environment so completely organized around spiritual cultivation had gradually brought every member of that community into a relationship with their element that other nations achieved only in exceptional individuals. In the military terms of the genocide, this fact lands with particular weight. The Fire Nation did not kill civilians while searching for the Avatar. There were no air nomad civilians in the conventional sense. Every person in every air nomad temple was capable of fighting back. Every person burned that morning was a bender. And the comet-enhanced fire still overwhelmed them, still burned the temples, still erased the culture. Not because they failed to fight, because the power differential on that particular day at that particular intensity exceeded what any amount of individual skill could have offset. A small number escaped the initial assaults, scattered into the Earth Kingdom, hid among the population. And Sozin, knowing this, ordered the fake safe houses, the planted relics, the rumors spread through spy networks, the traps designed to use the survivors' desperate longing for community as the mechanism of their final elimination. The surviving airbenders walked toward what sounded like hope and found waiting soldiers. Not one survived. Not one, except a boy in a ball of ice at the bottom of the Southern Ocean, his bison curled around him, waiting for 100 years to be found by 2 teenagers in a small boat on a field of white. Part 3. The Avatar Cycle. Death, Rebirth, and the Weight of 10,000 Years. The Avatar Cycle, at its most fundamental level, is a story about the relationship between continuity and identity. It asks a question that every serious spiritual tradition that takes reincarnation seriously eventually must confront. If a soul passes through multiple lives, what exactly is the thing that persists? What makes Aang a continuation of Roku rather than simply a new person who happens to occupy the same cosmic role? The show handles this with more philosophical depth than it strictly needed to, given that it was made for children, and arrives at an answer that is both specific to its world and resonant beyond it. The answer has everything to do with Rava. 10,000 years before Aang is found in the ice, humans do not live on the ground. They live on the backs of creatures called lion turtles, enormous beyond ordinary animal scale, ancient beyond what most living things can achieve, sentient in a way that manifests as both the ability to speak and a kind of patient, geological timescale wisdom. Their shells are large enough to support entire cities. Their lives span millennia. They remember things that human civilizations have no records of, and will remember them long after the humans on their backs have been replaced by generations who have forgotten what the previous ones knew. The lion turtles are the original source of bending. Not benders themselves exactly, but beings so deeply integrated with the elemental forces of the world that they can grant other creatures access to those forces. When humans who lived on a fire lion turtle needed to venture out into the spirit wilds to hunt or to travel, the lion turtle would give them the temporary ability to control fire for protection. Different lion turtle cities had affinities for different elements. The bending was a loan, not a possession. Into this world, Wan is born. He grows up on the Fire Lion Turtle City in the class of people who work for the wealthy families. He is clever and hungry in the way that people raised without enough always are. He steals fire to give to people in his community who are starving, is caught, and is banished from the city into the spirit wilds. But the lion turtle lets him keep the fire. Wan spends years in the spirit wilds, learning to live among spirits, developing his relationship with fire beyond what anyone in his city had ever had sustained access to develop. He eventually travels to other lion turtle cities and, through a combination of ingenuity and what can only be described as exceptional interpersonal skills with entities that are not persons in any ordinary sense, acquires the ability to use all four elements. He becomes the first human being capable of bending all four at once, though he can only use them one at a time without help. The help comes from Rava, one of the two primordial spirits at the heart of the Avatar world's cosmology. Rava is the spirit of peace and light, of forces that tend toward coherence and flourishing rather than dissolution and destruction. Her counterpart is Vatu, the spirit of darkness and chaos, and the two have been in eternal conflict since before anything recognizable as the world existed in its current form. Every 10,000 years, at an event called harmonic convergence, their struggle reaches a peak, and whichever spirit wins determines the character of the next age. Wan encounters them at a moment of conflict, misreads the situation, and accidentally frees Vatu from Rava's grasp. This mistake defines the rest of his life. Vatu, freed, begins to spread through the world. The spirits become hostile to humanity. The damage cascades into something much larger than a single act of good-intentioned stupidity could seem to generate. Wan and Rava form a partnership that begins as reluctant pragmatism and deepens, over the years of preparation for the next harmonic convergence, into something that functions as genuine love of the most particular kind. The love that develops between two beings who have been through enough together that their understanding of each other goes deeper than language. Rava could merge temporarily with Wan to allow him to use multiple elements simultaneously, but the process was painful for both and limited in duration. Full merger waited for harmonic convergence. At the next harmonic convergence, they merged permanently. The two became one being. Wan became the first avatar, and when he died, as humans do, inevitably, despite everything Rava carried forward, not memories, exactly, but the accumulated spiritual weight of what Wan had been. The compressed experience of a person who had chosen to be something larger than a person. She carried it into the next life, and the next, and the next. Through 10,000 years of reincarnation through all four nations in sequence, each avatar building on the work of the one before, each lifetime adding to the accumulated understanding that Rava preserved between them. This is why the avatar state is not simply a power amplifier. When Aang enters the avatar state, he is accessing the people, hundreds of specific people, who lived and learned and struggled and died across 10 millennia, whose essence Rava is still carrying. They are present in him in a way that is more than memory. When he enters the state and his eyes and arrows glow with white light, it is all of them moving at once. The avatar cycles order air, water, earth, fire. Repeating means the avatar is always born into the nation elementally opposite to the one that produced the previous avatar. This creates, in theory, a rotating pattern of responsibility. Every nation has, every 4 generations, a child born within its borders who will be the world's keeper. The identification of that child, the tests, the reaching for the relics, the early signs of cross-elemental ability was part of the Order of the White Lotus's responsibility for centuries. The system had its failures. Avatar Kyoshi was homeless and an orphan as a child, her existence uncertain enough that the White Lotus initially identified the wrong person as the Avatar, her friend Yoon, who genuinely believed he was the Avatar, and whose grief when the truth emerged sent him down a path that neither he nor anyone around him could have predicted. The weight of the Avatar cycle falls not only on the Avatars themselves but on everyone around them. Gyatso loved Aang fully, and had to watch the institution of the Avatar try to remove that love from Aang's life in service of a calling Aang had not chosen. Zuko's mother Ursa made a bargain to save her son's life, a bargain that exiled her from everything she knew, because the Avatar cycle is a force that reshapes the lives of everyone it touches, even the people who are simply trying to protect one child who matters to them. The lion turtles, in Aang's time, are thought to be myths. They have withdrawn from the world or been hunted to near extinction. The show implies both. Then one surfaces, enormous and patient and ancient beyond any other living thing, to teach Aang energy bending, the original form that predates all four elements, the ability to directly touch the life force of another living being. It is the lion turtle's gift to Wan that began the Avatar cycle 10,000 years ago. It is the lion turtle's gift to Aang that ends the 100-year war without Aang having to kill anyone. A circle closing. 10,000 years of history bending back toward its beginning. Part 4. The spirit world, a universe running parallel. Somewhere alongside the physical world, not above it or below it in any direction a compass can point, but alongside it in a dimension that no physical instrument can locate, there is another realm. It has geography of a kind, places that persist and that experienced travelers can navigate, but the geography responds to emotional and spiritual conditions rather than to physical laws. Grief makes it darker. Peace creates light that has no visible source. Ancient trauma leaves marks in the landscape itself that persist for centuries. The spirit world is populated by entities the show calls spirits, but the word is too small for what they are. Some are what we might recognize as nature spirits, the embodiment of a forest, of a river, of a mountain. Some are concepts given form, ideas so fundamental to the structure of the world that they have developed something like consciousness simply by being so consistently and completely themselves for so long. Some are things that defy categorization entirely. Wan Shi Tong He, who knows 10,000 things, takes the form of an enormous barn owl when he manifests, black and white, silent when he moves despite being larger than any bird should be. He is the keeper of a library accumulated across eons, maintained by fox-like spirits called knowledge seekers who travel the physical world collecting texts and bringing them back. The library is, functionally, the most complete record of human and spirit history that exists anywhere in the Avatar world. It contains things that no other source has preserved. He is also deeply, bitterly disillusioned with humans. The show gives him this quality without making him a simple villain. He is not wrong. Humans have used his library's knowledge to make war for as long as they have had access to it. He has seen scholars come with genuine curiosity and leave with information they then used to kill people. His distrust of human motives is well earned beyond any reasonable dispute. When Sokka brings Team Avatar to the library in the second season and uses its resources to identify the window that the solar eclipse will create for an invasion, when Wan Shi Tong realizes what they have done, his response is not rage in the human sense. It is something quieter and more devastating. He had hoped, perhaps, that these particular humans were different. The confirmation that they were not different is not a surprise to him. It is a disappointment so deep and so familiar that it has become the defining texture of his entire relationship with humanity. He takes the library beneath the sand. He seals it in the spirit world where physical world humans cannot reach it. The knowledge that took eons to accumulate disappears behind a surface of desert sand, and an enormous owl who has seen 100,000 years of human history is not, in any meaningful sense, surprised by how it ended. The show does not frame this as a villain's action. It frames it as a natural consequence. Wan Shi Tong is not evil. He is an ancient being protecting something precious from a pattern of behavior he has observed consistently for thousands of years. His withdrawal is self-defense. Ko, the face stealer, operates at the opposite extreme of the spirit world's character range. Where Wan Shi Tong is disillusioned, Ko is predatory. Where Wan Shi Tong has terms you can meet, Ko has a single rule that is both perfectly simple and essentially impossible. Show no emotion in his presence, and he will not take your face. Show any emotion, any trace of feeling, any flicker of recognition, and he will. He lives beneath a great gnarled tree in a barren, twilit corner of the spirit world, his domain populated by the faceless figures of the creatures whose expressions he has claimed. He can cycle through those stolen faces, wearing them one after another, showing you the faces of people you might recognize, faces designed to provoke exactly the reaction he is waiting for. He has been doing this for an incomprehensible length of time and has refined the practice of provocation to a precise and patient art. The backstory between Ko and the Avatar cycle involves Avatar Kuruk, the waterbender who preceded Kyoshi, a man who by external accounts lived a charmed and relatively easy Avatar life, moving through the world with natural charisma and a lightness that made his burden seem light. The truth was different. Ko had taken the face of Kuruk's betrothed, a woman named Umi, on their wedding day. The ease that people saw in Kuruk was a shell built over the grief of that loss. He spent his shortened years hunting the most dangerous spirits in the spirit world, not as avatar duty, but as a private war against the forces that had taken what he loved most. The war wore down his health and shortened his lifespan significantly. He never found what he was looking for. Aang has to enter Ko's domain in the first season's finale to retrieve information about the moon and ocean spirits. He has to maintain absolute emotional stillness while Ko cycles through stolen faces directly in front of him, including, at one point, the face of someone Aang loves. The spiritual discipline required to pass through Ko's presence intact is, in its own way, more demanding than any bending feat in the show. It requires a quality of inner steadiness that very few people ever develop, let alone display under direct and expert provocation. Aang succeeds. He leaves with what he needs, and Ko waits with the patience of something very ancient and very certain of its own eventual opportunity. The moon spirit and the ocean spirit, Tui and La, made the choice that is perhaps the most quietly profound in the show's entire mythology. They chose the physical world. They became koi fish in a sacred pool because being present to the world in that specific and embodied way mattered more to them than the freedom of the spirit plane. The yin-yang symbol that the two of them create as they swim their eternal circle is not decorative. It is literal. Two spirits in physical form, their movement creating the ancient symbol of balance, their existence maintaining the conditions that allow waterbending to function. When Admiral Zhao kills the moon spirit when he reaches into that pool and removes the white koi from the water, everything that depends on Tui's existence responds immediately. The moon goes dark. The waterbenders of the Northern Water Tribe lose their power. And something in La, now alone where it was always paired, becomes something other than what it was. Zhao's decision was never truly about strategy. It was about an ego so immense it had convinced him that destroying one of the most sacred things in the world was an acceptable price for a military victory. The ocean, having lost its partner, becomes something terrible in its grief. La merging with Aang in the Avatar state to create a force that swept through the Fire Nation fleet with the indifference of an actual natural disaster is the direct consequence of one man's choice to treat the sacred as tactical. Princess Yue's sacrifice returning to Tui, the life that Tui had given her as an infant, becoming the moon spirit herself is the show's most direct statement about the interconnection of human and spirit worlds. The boundary between them is not absolute. People cross it in both directions. And sometimes the crossing is permanent, and the world is better for it, and the person who made it becomes the thing they needed most to become. Part 5. The 100-Year War. How it actually unfolded. The Fire Nation's official history of the war begins with Sozin's generosity and ends with the ongoing effort to share that generosity with a world still too limited to fully appreciate it. This is the version taught in Fire Nation schools. This is the version that a Fire Nation child recites with complete sincerity when asked what the war is about, recites with the confidence of someone who has never been given a single credible reason to question it. This is the version that 100 years of institutional investment has made feel more real than anything you might learn elsewhere. The actual history begins considerably differently. Sozin and Roku were friends. Not political allies, not diplomatic partners, but genuine childhood friends, born on the same day, grown up together, celebrated their birthdays together through all the years of their youth. They were different in important ways. Roku was gentle where Sozin was ambitious. Roku held still where Sozin moved toward the next thing. But they were friends in the deep way that only people who shared a formative world can truly be. They understood each other at a level that formal relationships rarely reach. Sozin's ideas about the Fire Nation's destiny, its obligation to share its wealth and advancement with the rest of the world, framed always as generosity, never as conquest, developed slowly over the years of his reign, testing limits cautiously before committing to anything decisive. The first Fire Nation colonies appeared on Earth Kingdom coastlines decades before the war's official start. Small settlements, probes, testing how far things could go before the Avatar intervened. Roku found the colonies, destroyed at least one, confronted Sozin in person, two old men who had been young men together, and in the confrontation did something that would reshape the entire century that followed. He won the fight and chose not to remove Sozin from power. He warned him. He trusted the friendship. He left. Sozin, watching his oldest friend walk away after declining the ultimate check, began calculating whether the relationship that had protected him was also, at this point, the obstacle standing between him and what he had spent decades planning. 25 years later, Roku's island volcano erupted. Sozin arrived on his dragon. They worked together to contain the lava flow, the two of them bending in concert for the last time, working with the coordination of people who had spent their lives alongside each other. And then the toxic gases overwhelmed Roku, and he was on the ground, and he was asking for help. And Sozin looked at him and at the future and made his decision. He left. Roku died. The Avatar cycle moved to the air nomads. And Sozin, who had spent years preparing for exactly this window, watched the comet arrive and ordered his armies to move. The coordination required by the initial attacks is itself a testament to decades of meticulous preparation. 4 air temples, positioned at 4 separate corners of the world, attacked simultaneously. Earth Kingdom and Water Tribe territories struck at the same time, to prevent any organized response from forming before the first phase of the campaign was complete. The logistics were not improvised. The military machine had been built specifically for this operation. Over years, while Roku was alive and watching and choosing, over and over, not to believe his friend had become exactly what he appeared to be becoming. The comet's enhancement of Fire Nation bending power fundamentally changed the tactical mathematics of every engagement. An airbender's defensive power rests on movement, on evasion, on making yourself impossible to hit through constant redirection and footwork. This works against an opponent whose attacks are precise and targeted. Against attacks that cover entire spaces with explosive fire, that don't require accuracy because they require only coverage, evasion becomes insufficient. The temples burned not because the airbenders failed to fight back. They burned because what they were facing had been transformed, by the comet, into something that exceeded the capacity of individual skill to offset. Some survived the initial assaults, scattered into the Earth Kingdom, tried to disappear. And Sozin's response to their survival, the fake safe houses, the planted sacred relics, the rumors spread through spy networks, designed to use the survivors' desperate longing for community as the mechanism of their final elimination, is the piece of the genocide's history that most clearly illuminates the brown, specific quality of his intelligence. Not rage, not fear. Cold strategic thinking applied to the problem of completion. The 100-year war that followed was not a single sustained campaign. It was a century-long process of occupation and resistance and negotiation and atrocity, its texture varying enormously depending on where you were experiencing it. The Earth Kingdom's occupied territories lived under Fire Nation administrators who managed resource extraction not comfortable, but not apocalyptic in the moment-to-moment texture of daily life. The show can depict ordinary markets, ordinary family dinners, ordinary moments of humor happening in the shadow of occupation, because that is how occupation actually functions. It does not eliminate ordinary life, it controls it. Ba Sing Se was the great exception throughout the entire century, the city that could not fall, the last unconquered territory of real symbolic significance. The walls, outer and inner, the outer never before breached, represented something beyond military value. They were the proof that resistance was possible. As long as Ba Sing Se stood, the war was unfinished. As long as the war was unfinished, it could still be lost. The city maintained its independence not only through its walls but through a system of social control that the show reveals to be nearly as sinister as the occupation the walls were keeping out. The Daily Ba Sing Se's cultural secret police maintained order through surveillance, brainwashing, and a policy of enforced informational suppression so complete that the city's population lived in genuine, manufactured ignorance about the war happening outside the walls. "There is no war in Ba Sing Se" was not simply a phrase. It was the operational principle of an entire administrative apparatus. The Earth King himself, insulated by layers of curated information and protected by advisors who had every incentive to maintain his ignorance, was genuinely surprised to learn that the war had been going on for a century. His surprise is played for comedy and is also, if you think about it for more than a moment, one of the more disturbing details in the show. The most powerful person in the most powerful remaining Earth Kingdom institution had been kept so thoroughly isolated from reality that reality itself came as a revelation. The Dai Li's eventual betrayal of Ba Sing Se to Azula is the show's most politically precise statement. They were not Fire Nation agents. They were Earth Kingdom natives who had built their identities entirely around the maintenance of order. Azula offered them a structure in which their power remained intact, their methods remained available, their institutional position was preserved. They chose their personal continuity over the thing they were supposed to protect. The walls never fell. The gates were opened from the inside by the people who were supposed to be guarding them. This is the show telling you something uncomfortable and true, that the mechanisms of authoritarian control are not primarily external forces. They are maintained by the people inside the system who have a personal stake in the system's continuation. The Fire Nation's internal culture across the century of war is shown in glimpses that accumulate into something more complex than a simple portrait of villainy. Not every Fire Nation citizen supported the war. Not every Fire Nation soldier was unaware that what they were doing was wrong. Zhang, the first person to voluntarily defect from the Fire Nation military, spent decades in hiding, haunted by what his fire had done to people over years of service, unable to separate his element from the harm it had been used for. Pian Dao, the greatest swordmaster of his generation, left the military and told his superiors he had defeated an entire battalion single-handedly, and they were too awed and too embarrassed to challenge the claim, and he retired to his castle and spent his life teaching the sword to anyone who showed up willing to learn. These people exist inside the Fire Nation system. They know what it is. They chose, as much as they could within the constraints of their world, not to be what it was asking them to be. This is what makes the Fire Nation feel like a real country, rather than a fantasy villain empire. Real countries doing terrible things are full of people who have complicated relationships to those things. Most of them don't do anything about it. A few of them build a secret society around a board game and quietly protect the world's hope from the shadows. Part 6, Zuko and Azula. Two sides of the same fire. There is a portrait on the wall of the beach house at Ember Island. It hangs in the background of a scene that appears to be about other things, and the camera never pauses to draw your attention to it. Two parents. Two young children. Ozai, seated, with the posture of a man who has never genuinely relaxed in his life. Ursa, standing, with the posture of a woman who is always slightly poised for something. Young Zuko, reaching toward his mother, his body angled in her direction in the way that young children's bodies angle toward the thing they love most. The movement entirely unstudied, entirely revealing. Young Azula, sitting apart, her expression already assembled rather than simply present, already the beginning of the performance that will define her for the next decade and a half of her life. The portrait is the entire family in a single image. The show hangs it on a wall and trusts you to find it. Zuko and Azula are shaped by the same household into radically opposite responses to it. This is the specific cruelty of damaging family dynamics, that the same parents, the same palace, the same culture, the same war can produce two people whose responses to their shared environment diverge so completely that they seem to come from different worlds. They did not. They came from the same world, processing it through different filters, arriving at different conclusions about what it meant and what it required. The difference in how they processed everything comes down to one variable: their mother. Ursa loved Azula in the complicated way that parents love children who seem determined to resist tenderness, genuinely, fully, but with a different quality than what she offered Zuko. Zuko received warmth freely. Azula received something more careful, more aware of the ways in which Azula was difficult to hold. Whether this was accurate parenting or the beginning of a pattern that would confirm Azula's worst suspicions about herself is the show's most unanswerable question. Azula's understanding of her mother was that Ursa thought she was a monster. She says this at the beach house with the flat affect of someone who has been turning a fact over in their mind for so long it has lost the sharpest edges of its original pain. My own mother thought I was a monster. She was right, of course, but it still hurt. The structure of that sentence contains an entire psychological history. She has preemptively agreed with the worst possible reading of herself. She has made the assessment before anyone else can, which is the only way to control it. If you call yourself a monster first, no one else's judgment can land quite as hard. This is the defense mechanism of someone who was told, implicitly and repeatedly, that the version of herself she actually was too perceptive, too capable, too aware of things children aren't supposed to notice was too much. The performance she built in response was not a disguise over some softer true self. It was what survived after years of being rewarded for hardness and penalized for anything that looked like softness. Ozai's parenting was conditional in the most damaging sense. He offered his approval as a reward for performance and withheld it as a punishment for anything that resembled weakness, vulnerability, or failure. For Azula, this system was not initially difficult. She was a prodigy. She mastered techniques in weeks that other children spent years on. She read people with a precision that adults found uncomfortable in a child. Ozai's system of conditional love rewarded excellence, and she could excel in any system that rewarded performance. She was, in that environment, the child who should have been fine. What she could not control was what happened when the system itself betrayed her. When Mai and Ty Lee held in their friendship with her through a careful balance of genuine affection and the specific fear that Azula generated in everyone close to her, chose conscience over that fear at the Boiling Rock. When Ozai, in the final hours of the war, excluded her from his vision of absolute victory and kept her in the capital as a consolation prize of a title rather than taking her with him, the people she had maintained through strategic management of their relationship to her fear discovered, in moments of genuine crisis, that the fear was not sufficient. The loss is not just tactical. It is the dismantling of an entire system she had built her sense of safety on. Without that system, there is no Azula as she has understood herself. There is only the child who was told she was a monster and chose to become one because it was the only form of control available. Her fire flickering between blue and orange in the finale is the show expressing her psychological state through the physics of her element. Azula bends at a temperature and with a control that puts her above virtually every other firebender in the series. The blue is real blue fire, burns hotter, burns more completely, represents a mastery of the element so refined that the fire itself is changed. When the blue starts flickering, going unsteady, shuddering between colors in a way her fire has never done before, the element is telling you what the performance has been hiding. The fire is Azula, and Azula is coming apart. Zuko's arc runs in the opposite direction. Where Azula descends, Zuko rises slowly, painfully, frequently interrupted by the specific gravity of unprocessed shame and the relentless pull of his father's approval. The show tracks his progress through the camera's relationship to his scar. In scenes where he is acting from shame and anger, the scarred side of his face dominates the frame. In scenes where he is showing growth or compassion, the unscarred side is presented. The storyboard artists built this into the visual grammar of the show, episode by episode, so consistently that it functions as a subconscious tracking system for which version of Zuko you are watching. The word honor tracks a parallel arc through his dialogue across 3 seasons. He says it constantly in the first season. It is practically punctuation, a talisman, the name of the thing he lost when his father banished him and must reclaim by capturing the Avatar. Honor is external, something to be obtained from an external source, the validation that will finally make him enough. By the second season, he says it less. He begins to question what it means, whether honor given by Ozai is honor at all. By the third season, he almost never says it. The word disappears not because the concept became meaningless, but because it became so integrated into his identity that he no longer needed to name it. That is how genuine character development works. Not through declarations, but through the absence of need. His final Agni Kai against Azula is deliberately unlike every other fight in the series. The camera pulls back, the music shifts to something slower, almost mournful. The shots are wide rather than close. The creators have said they wanted the fight to feel like a funeral rather than a victory. 2 siblings, shaped by the same family into people who can only relate to each other as opponents, finishing what their childhood started. What remains at the end is not triumph. It is the specific sadness of things that were inevitable and that cost too much regardless. Part 7. The Order of the White Lotus, The Secret Brotherhood. Somewhere in the first season of Avatar, if you know what to watch for, you can see Iroh lose a game of Pai Sho on purpose. Not because he is bad at Pai Sho, the show establishes quickly that he is extraordinarily good at it, but because losing allows him to move a specific tile onto the board in a specific position, and the man sitting across from him, a tea shop owner whose connection to the narrative seems incidental, responds by placing his own tiles in a complementary pattern. A blooming lotus begins to take shape on the board, tile by tile, the image assembling itself between two men who appear to be simply playing a game. With that pattern, a message passes between them that has nothing to do with the game and everything to do with the world outside the door. The Order of the White Lotus is, for most of the show, a presence you can almost see if you're looking. An organization that the show trusts you to locate before it names it through the accumulated weight of moments that don't quite fit an old man who plays Pai Sho everywhere he goes, who seems to find fellow players in suspiciously convenient locations when he and his nephew most need help, who receives assistance from strangers with a specificity that suggests the strangers are not entirely strangers. The Order began, by the account in the show's extended mythology, as exactly what it sounds like: a club, a small gathering of people who were serious enough about Pai Sho to seek out others at the same level of commitment and sophistication. The game was created by spirits. This detail appears in the show's supplementary materials, and it has a structural complexity that rewards the kind of mind that finds beauty in systems. People who cared enough about Pai Sho to seek out other serious players tended to be, as a group, the kind of people who thought carefully about the world and had developed considered views about how it should work. As the membership grew, so did the scope of what the organization was doing. The club became a conversation. The conversation became a community of practice, and the community of practice developed a shared set of purposes: the preservation of knowledge across national boundaries, the guidance of the Avatar when guidance was possible, the maintenance of a network of people committed to the world's balance even when the political structures around them were committed to something very different. The lotus tile gives the organization its name and its identification system. In Pai Sho, placing the white lotus tile in a specific position on the board, the White Lotus Gambit, is a signal. A member of the Order who wants to identify themselves to another possible member begins their game with the gambit. If the other player recognizes it and responds correctly, the identification is complete without either person having said anything that couldn't be overheard by anyone in the room. In a world where the Fire Nation spent 100 years hunting dissidents, where being identified as opposed to the regime had serious consequences, this was functionally genius. Two old men playing a board game in a tavern are not suspicious. Two old men playing a board game in a tavern who are actually exchanging intelligence, arranging safe passage for fugitives, coordinating actions across national borders that is considerably harder to see from the outside if you are not one of them. The members revealed by the show, Iroh, Bumi, Pakku, Zhong, Piandao, are a remarkable collection of people whose shared characteristic is that they have all survived long enough and thought deeply enough to have developed a relationship to their nation's institutions that is not simply membership. Jiang lives in exile because he cannot be what the Fire Nation military wants him to be and remain who he actually is. He is a firebender who hates fire, who has seen too much of what fire does to people when used the way the Fire Nation uses it, and who has made of that knowledge a private and ongoing burden that keeps him from the ordinary satisfactions of a life in the country that trained him. Piandao was born to firebending parents who did not pass the ability to their son, raised in a culture that associated worth fundamentally with bending ability. He could have been defined by this. Instead, he became so extraordinarily skilled with a sword that when the Fire Nation army sent troops to conscript him back, he defeated the entire battalion single-handedly and reported this to his superiors, who were simultaneously awed and deeply embarrassed, and decided that granting him his retirement was less problematic than pressing the issue. His loyalty to the Order rather than to the Fire Nation is, among the White Lotus members, perhaps the cleanest expression of what the Order was always about: choosing an idea over an institution. King Bumi of Omashu is the most counterintuitive member of the group. He is ancient, apparently eccentric, possessed of a sense of humor that operates at a frequency most people around him cannot locate. He eats rocks, He laughs at things no one else finds funny. He is exactly the kind of person who seems, at a superficial reading, like comic relief rather than a master. He is also one of the most powerful earthbenders alive and a man who spent 100 years under Fire Nation occupation, playing mad, waiting. Not waiting because he had given up, waiting because he had calculated, with the specific patience of someone who has studied long-term strategy at a level most people never reach, that this was the moment that would require his kind of power, and that arriving at it intact mattered more than acting sooner. When the White Lotus reveals itself in the series finale, when Iroh summons them to liberate Ba Sing Se, while Aang faces Ozai, the show gives you something it has been withholding carefully across 3 seasons. The sight of what mastery looks like when it is not performing for anyone, when it is simply being applied to a task that matters. These are old people. They are not at the height of their physical prime. They are people who have been carrying a commitment through a century of wrong directions, who have been quiet when silence was required, who are being given, finally, the opportunity to do openly and completely what they have been doing in careful pieces for a very long time. Iroh leading the charge on Ba Sing Se is not simply a battle sequence. It is the completion of a personal circuit that began with the 600-day siege and Lu Ten's death, and the retreat that shamed him in the eyes of his nation. The city where his son died. The city he failed to take as a general, for which failure he was supplanted by his brother and displaced from the future that should have been his. He is coming back to it now in the only capacity that would let him return without shame. Not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Not serving the Fire Nations project, but ending it. The lotus flower, in Buddhist and Hindu and Chinese philosophical traditions, is a symbol built around a specific and profound idea. It grows from mud, from murky and difficult conditions, and rises to bloom above the surface of the water, clean and complete. It is the symbol of enlightenment achieved through difficulty, of purity that comes not from avoiding the dark but from moving through it and becoming something that the dark could not finally contain. The Order of the White Lotus named itself for a symbol of exactly that journey. Part 8 Iroh, the most layered character in animation. There is a version of the Avatar story in which Iroh is the villain, in which the Dragon of the West fulfills his destiny the way destiny was offering it, taking Ba Sing Se, ascending to the throne his father intended him to occupy, continuing the project that Sozin began. In that version, the 100-year war has a different shape. Maybe it ends sooner. Maybe it ends worse. Maybe the boy frozen in the ice is never found in time. The version we have instead is the one in which Iroh lost his son. Everything about who Iroh is when the audience meets him is a consequence of what Lu Ten's death did to the person Iroh was before. Understanding who Iroh was before the death is necessary to understand who he became after. The Dragon of the West was not a gentleman. The nickname tells you something. Dragons, in the Fire Nation's military culture before the full truth about them was known, were symbols of dominance, and earning the title required demonstrating that dominance at a scale other generals could only observe from a respectful distance. Iroh earned it genuinely. He led armies, won battles, and laid siege to the most defended city in the world for 600 consecutive days, more than a year and a half of sustained military operation, maintaining an army in the field, pressing against those walls every day while Ba Sing Se's defenders tried to outlast him. He breached the outer wall. No Fire Nation general had ever done that. He came closer to taking Ba Sing Se than anyone in a century of trying, and he was preparing to organize the assault on the inner wall when a messenger arrived from the front lines with news that no preparation could have made easier to receive. Lu Ten was dead. The show does not show us this moment directly. We see Iroh speak of his son in fragments, a brief mention, a reference in passing, the scene at the tiny altar in the Tales of Ba Sing Se, where he sets up a small memorial and sings the lullaby he used to sing to Lu Ten as a child. We piece together the shape of the grief from its aftermath, the withdrawal from the siege, the retreat that was read by the Fire Nation's military culture as failure and as shame, the loss of interest in the throne that had been his by birth, even when his brother Ozai took advantage of the chaos to claim it. The years of wandering that followed. What the death did, ultimately, was strip away the scaffolding. The project, the conquest, the ascent, the fulfillment of expectation had meaning as long as it was something he was building for himself, for his sense of legacy, for the continuation of what his family had built. Lu Ten's death made the project suddenly and permanently visible in its actual terms. The cost of the siege was children dying on the front lines, His own child had died on the front lines. The thing he was trying to accomplish had required the exact sacrifice it had just demanded of him personally. He could not pretend anymore that the trade was worth it. He went home. His brother was on the throne. He had no interest in contesting this. The hunger that would have made him fight for what was his had gone quiet and did not return. He spent years traveling, learning from sources outside the tradition he had been raised in, studying waterbending principles deeply enough to invent a technique that had never existed before, lightning redirection, which applied waterbending's philosophical principle of receiving and redirecting force to a firebending context, creating something that the martial arts categories of either nation could not fully account for. He went to places with no strategic value and studied things with no military application and discovered, slowly, who he was when he was not the dragon of the West. He learned tea. In Chinese and Japanese philosophical traditions, tea carries weight that casual Western usage of the word does not suggest. Tea ceremony is a practice of presence, the attention given to the quality of the water, the temperature of the steep, the specific conditions of this particular cup being prepared at this particular moment for this particular person. It is a meditative practice that runs parallel to what other traditions do through seated stillness, achieving through careful attention to the immediate what others achieve through deliberate disengagement from it. Iroh's love for tea is his philosophy made physical. It is how he insists, in the middle of a war, in the middle of exile, in the middle of everything going wrong everywhere, that this moment matters. That this cup, made right now, for this person in front of him, is real and valuable and worth doing correctly. He makes tea for everyone throughout the series. For Zuko, obviously. For Toph, in a chance encounter that the show treats with exactly the weight it deserves, two people, one very old and one very young, both outsiders in the city they're inhabiting, sharing a moment of uncomplicated warmth. He attempts to make tea for enemies and for captors. He makes terrible tea in the Earth Kingdom because the local leaves are wrong, and announces this without embarrassment to anyone who will listen. He is entirely undefended about his love for tea, which reveals everything about how he has decided to live, not performing strength, not maintaining the image of a feared general, but simply being a person who finds genuine pleasure in a cup made well. The Tales of Ba Sing Se segment, the short personal story that follows Iroh spending a day in Ba Sing Se alone, is the scene that most completely shows who he has become. He helps a young thief without reporting him. He assists a weeping child in finding her way home. He helps a young man prepare to serenade a woman he loves. He participates, without any need to be acknowledged or remembered, in the small human work of making the days of specific strangers slightly better. At the end of the day, he finds a small shop selling a figurine that reminds him of Lu Ten. He sets up a tiny memorial in a room. He lights incense. He sings. The song is the lullaby he used to sing to his son, and the voice of the man performing it carries something that formal descriptions of emotion cannot fully hold, the specific quality of grief that has been with someone long enough to become their companion rather than their enemy, a sadness that is also a love, a loss that has become a form of ongoing tenderness toward what was lost. Mako Iwamatsu recorded this scene while dying of esophageal cancer. He died on the 21st of July 2006. The episode aired on September 29 of the same year. The dedication card reads, "In honor of Mako." The moment was already, as written, the most affecting scene in the series. What Mako's death brought to it is the thing that cannot be added by writing or direction or technical craft. The knowledge that the voice singing the lullaby belonged to a man who was saying goodbye to things. The devotion in the performance is real. The grief in it is real. The love that comes through it is real in a way that extends beyond the story it was created to serve. Iroh, after his death in the physical world, chooses the spirit world. Not reincarnation, not dissolution into the cosmic background, but a permanent and specific location. A tea shop, where he makes tea for whoever passes through. Spirits who have business in that part of the spirit world find an old man in an apron who will listen and offer something warm. It is the most completely Iroh ending imaginable. It is the show's quiet statement that the path to meaning is not through the accumulation of power or the maintenance of legacy, but through the consistent and patient practice of being genuinely present to the people in front of you, whoever they are, whatever they need, for as long as you are able to do it. Part 9. The Bending Arts. Real martial philosophy made visible. The foundational decision that separates Avatar's bending system from the magic systems in virtually every other fantasy work of its era is the decision to anchor each bending style in a real martial art with a real philosophy behind it. Not inspired by, not loosely referencing, but actually grounded in, taught by an actual practitioner, with actual video reference of actual techniques performed by Sifu Kisu of the Harmonious Fist Chinese Athletic Association, which the animators then used as frame-by-frame guides for every significant bending sequence in the series. The implications of this decision extended far beyond the fights themselves, because each martial art carries within it a complete set of principles about how to relate to force, to opponents, to the world, principles developed over centuries of practice and refinement. Those principles inevitably shaped the character of each bending culture. You can understand what the Fire Nation believes about the relationship between power and the world by watching how firebenders move. You can understand the Water Tribe's philosophy about yielding and redirection by watching Katara's forms evolve across 3 seasons. The bending is the philosophy, embodied, made visible through the body rather than articulated through words. Waterbending is rooted in Tai Chi Chuan, one of the Chinese internal martial arts, distinguished from external styles by its emphasis on internal energy cultivation and on the principle of using an opponent's force rather than opposing it directly. The name translates roughly as Supreme Ultimate Fist, though the name understates the style's character. Tai Chi is soft in its surface quality. Its practitioners move in ways that look, to an inexperienced observer, almost casual round transitions, weight shifts, the kind of movement that could be mistaken for a slow morning exercise routine until you understand what it is actually doing. The underlying principle is that yielding is not weakness, that receiving an attack and redirecting it is not only more effective than direct opposition but philosophically superior, because it works with the nature of force rather than against it. Water does not resist the stone. Water flows around the stone, under it, over it, and eventually shapes the stone through the consistent application of this principle across enough time. This is what Katara bends with. This is what she becomes across 3 seasons of development that the animators tracked with a care most series reserve for the lead character. Her growth is visible in the animation itself if you watch for it across episodes. In early Book 1, her water movements are powered by emotion and determination. She generates significant force, but the control is imprecise, the forms ragged at their edges, the results inconsistent. After training with the stolen waterbending scroll and later with Paku at the Northern Water Tribe, the forms become cleaner, the transitions smoother, the quality of her attention to the water itself more evident in every movement. By the finale, she is bending with the controlled, flowing intelligence of someone who has genuinely internalized the principle. She doesn't defeat Azula through superior raw power. She defeats her by using the environment, by moving with the conditions of the moment rather than imposing her will against them, by being precisely what Tai Chi teaches you to be. Earthbending is Hung Gar, which means Hung Family Fist, and originates from the period following the destruction of the Shaolin Temple by Qing dynasty forces in the 17th century. Survivors developed the style in conditions of loss, needing a form powerful enough to be effective, while stripped of the elaborate resources of their original tradition. Hung Gar is characterized by its deep, low stances, which root the practitioner into the ground with an almost geological stubbornness. The strikes are heavy rather than fast. The defensive postures are solid rather than evasive. This is a style built for people who cannot afford to be moved. The earthbending philosophy articulated through Toph, who inherited the deepest understanding of earthbending from the Badger Moles, the original earthbenders, and brought it to its logical extreme in her own practice, is that you meet force with equal force. You don't yield, you don't redirect. You stand, and you push back, and you trust that your connection to the earth beneath you gives you a stability that no external force can remove if you genuinely commit to it. This is philosophically opposite to waterbending, and the show understands and exploits that opposition throughout the series, particularly in the dynamic between Katara and Toph. Toph's personal style is not Hung Gar. This is one of the details that rewards close attention to the fight choreography because it reveals something significant about how the bending system was designed. Where other earthbenders use wide, heavy stances and power-based strikes, Toph uses Chugar, a branch of southern praying mantis style. Chugar emphasizes sensitivity over raw power, the ability to feel what an opponent is doing through physical contact and respond in real time before the movement completes. It uses narrower, higher stances than Hungar. It favors close-range engagement over the open-field boulder throwing of standard earthbending practice. This is not an arbitrary choice. Toph is small. The body weight differential between her and most opponents makes pure power bending less viable than it would be for a larger person. What she has that compensates for size is her seismic sense, a perception that extends through the earth, that gives her awareness of every vibration in her environment with a precision that most visual perception cannot match. Chugar's emphasis on sensitivity and real-time responsiveness is the perfect fighting system for someone whose entire perceptual apparatus is based on feeling rather than seeing. Her martial art is not just a fighting style. It is an expression of her nature, chosen because it matches who she is with a precision that would seem designed if it weren't also inevitable. Airbending is Baguazhong. The art takes its name from the 8 trigrams of the I Ching, the ancient Chinese philosophical text, and its practice encodes within physical movement a cosmological idea. That reality consists of relationships between complementary forces, and that wisdom means understanding how to move within those relationships rather than trying to dominate them. The practitioner circles around a central point, using footwork that spirals inward or outward, always maintaining an oblique rather than a direct relationship to whatever they are engaging with. You cannot be hit if you are never where the hit lands. Aang's airbending is pure Baguazhang in its principles, but the animators gave it an additional quality that the martial art alone doesn't quite capture: genuine lightness. They gave Aang a running cycle different from every other character in the show lighter, with less contact time with the ground, as if he is perpetually on the verge of liftoff. Even when not actively bending, his relationship with air affects how he moves through space. He skims rather than walks. He lands from heights with a compression that dissipates instantly. The element is always slightly more present in his movement than gravity strictly requires, and this detail communicates, without a single word of explanation, that Aang belongs to a different relationship with the physical world than the people around him. Firebending is Northern Shaolin, one of the most widely practiced of the Northern Chinese Kung Fu styles, originating from the Henan Shaolin Monastery in roughly the 7th or 8th century. It is characterized by aggressive footwork, wide stances that move rapidly across ground, powerful sweeping kicks, and strikes that combine speed with force. Northern Shaolin practitioners press forward. They close distance quickly, maintain pressure, generate power from the momentum of their own advance. The style reads, in bending terms, as inherently offensive. This maps almost perfectly onto the Fire Nation's military philosophy and its 100-year-long conduct of the war. The Fire Nation attacks. It moves first. It establishes dominance through initiative and sustained pressure. When forced to defend rather than advance, its bending style becomes less expressive of its underlying nature. The 100-Year War was conducted on the Fire Nation's preferred terms: the offense, the initiative, the choice of when and where and how hard to press for a century, precisely because that preference was built into the elemental philosophy the nation had been teaching for generations. What the show reveals about fire's true nature through the dragons Ran and Shaw, through the Sun Warriors who still practice the original tradition, through Zuko's crisis when his fire weakens after joining Team Avatar, is that all of this is a deviation from the source. Fire is not, at its origin, about aggression. The first firebenders learned from dragons in a tradition that predated the war by millennia, and the dragon fire that Ran and Shaw demonstrate to Aang and Zuko in the 3rd season contains all colors, moves with something recognizable as intelligence and tenderness, feels less like a weapon and more like a language. The Fire Nation lost this understanding, or more precisely, Sozin's militarization of the nation over 100 years of war progressively reduced the element from something sacred to something tactical. The soldiers who fight in the series are not drawing from fire's true source. They are drawing from an emotion, rage, pride, the aggressive territorial drive that the military culture cultivated specifically because it produced useful combat energy. They are burning on the surface of what fire is rather than at its center. When Aang and Zuko stand in the dragonfire and receive the original teaching, the fire that requires them not to attack, but to receive and respond, to treat the element as a conversation rather than a weapon, it is the show's most complete statement about the nature of power. The greatest version of any element is not its most destructive version. It is its most essential version, the closest it comes to what it actually is, underneath everything the world has done to it. Part 10. What holds it all together? There is a hierarchy to bending knowledge in the Avatar world that the show reveals only gradually, and that most viewers may never fully assemble into a single picture. It goes deeper than the four elements. Beneath each element's ordinary practice are extensions, forms of bending, that require either exceptional skill or a particular quality of awareness that most practitioners never develop. And beneath all four extensions, there is something older than all of them, the original form, the one the lion turtles granted and that the Avatar rediscovered in the series finale. Water's hidden depth is bookended by two practices that exist in radical philosophical tension. On one end, healing. The ability to use water's sensitivity to chi, its capacity to attune to the energy currents of the living body for repair rather than combat. Katara discovers this instinctively before it is ever named for her, in the early episodes of Book 1, reaching for water when someone is injured in a gesture that feels organic rather than deliberate. The show has been showing you her healing ability for 18 episodes before it gives you a name for it, trusting that you will absorb it as a natural part of who she is. The technique requires genuine attunement to the person being healed, not just technical water control, but a quality of empathic attention, a willingness to feel where the disruption in another body's energy lies, and to move with it rather than imposing a correction. It is, in its philosophy, pure Tai Chi, receiving what is there, working with the nature of what you find, trusting that the most effective response to disruption is to flow around it until the disrupted thing has space to reorder itself. On the other end of water's hidden depth, bloodbending. The technique Hama discovers in imprisonment, in conditions of isolation and desperation, and the specific creativity that emerges when ordinary resources are completely unavailable. Once a waterbender fully grasps that the human body is between 60 and 70% water, that the blood, the lymph, the fluid in every cell is, in principle, something they can feel and potentially move, the implication follows automatically. A waterbender of sufficient sensitivity can control a living body, can make it move against its owner's will, can exert authority over the most intimate space in the world, the physical self of another person. The show does not present this as a simple villain's tool. Hama is someone who developed the technique in response to genuine imprisonment and genuine cruelty. She was captured during one of the Fire Nation's systematic raids on the Southern Water Tribe. She was held in a Fire Nation prison for years. She used the only resource available to her, her bending, and specifically her ability to draw moisture from the very earth of her cell to free herself. The path from imprisonment to bloodbending is not a comfortable one to follow empathetically, but it is a comprehensible one. You cannot fully condemn Hama without fully accounting for what was done to her first. What bloodbending reveals about waterbending is what all of the elemental extensions reveal about their parent elements. The same capacity, the same fundamental sensitivity, can be used in radically different ways, and the difference between healing and bloodbending is not a difference in skill level. It is entirely a difference in what the bender chooses to attend to and how they choose to use what they find. The gift is the same. The ethics are entirely in the hands of the person carrying it. Earthbending's great hidden extension is metal bending, invented by Toph at the moment it becomes necessary and demonstrates, more completely than any other elemental extension in the show, how the deepest insights in bending come not from greater force but from more precise perception. She is imprisoned in a wooden cell because someone correctly identified that an earthbender in a wooden prison has nothing to bend. But the cell has metal fixtures, bolts in the walls, a metal floor, and metal, refined as it is, still carries within it the microscopic remnants of the earth it came from trace impurities, the evidence of origin, the thing that no refining process can fully eliminate if the starting material was once stone. Toph's seismic sense is fine enough to find those impurities, to feel the earth within the metal, to bend the earth within the metal and, by bending it, bend the metal around it. She is not doing something categorically new. She is doing what earthbenders have always done, extended to a scale of precision that no previous earthbender had the perceptual capacity to reach. The technique was always possible within earthbending's principles. It simply required someone whose sensitivity to the element was extraordinary enough to find the path. The connection between Toph's perceptual apparatus and her bending ability between the seismic sense that her blindness made her develop to extraordinary levels and the metal bending that her extraordinary seismic sense made, Possible is the show's most complete argument for the idea that what appears to be a limitation from the outside can be, from the inside, the very thing that makes a person capable of something no one else has ever reached. Her blindness is not what she overcame to become great. Her blindness is the specific condition under which her greatness became possible. Fire's hidden extension lightning generation is reserved for the most exceptional Fire Nation benders in the show's present day. It requires a separation of positive and negative energy within the body, a deliberate creation of the conditions that produce lightning in nature, a level of internal control that the aggressive, emotion-fueled style of contemporary Fire Nation bending is almost inherently incompatible with. The technique requires, above everything, a quality of inner stillness. Azula can generate lightning because she has learned to maintain her inner performance of stillness, even when her inner reality is turbulent. Ozai can generate it. Almost no one else can. Iroh's lightning redirection is the philosophical inversion of lightning generation, and its existence demonstrates something important about the Avatar world's bending system. The barriers between elements are not absolute. The principles underlying one element can be applied in the domain of another if the practitioner understands both deeply enough. Iroh studied waterbending not to become a waterbender, but to understand what waterbending knew about the movement of force through a system. He brought that understanding back to firebending and created something new, a technique that uses water's philosophy of reception and redirection in fire's domain. When Iroh or Zuko redirects lightning, the movement they use is Tai Chi, not Northern Shaolin. The animators literally change the martial art in the middle of the technique. The philosophy shifts mid-motion from fire's aggressive advance to water's yielding redirect. The lightning enters through one hand, travels through the body along the body's energy channels, and exits through the other hand and into the earth or sky. The movement is the philosophy made physical. It is the show, in 2 seconds of animation, demonstrating that the person who bends it has gone somewhere most firebenders never go. Outside the tradition they were born into the territory of understanding rather than performance. The Avatar is the only person in the world who carries all 4 of these philosophies simultaneously, who has the potential to understand them not as alternatives to each other, but as complementary aspects of a single, larger truth. About how force and consciousness and the world relate, the Avatar cycle is, in this light, not only a cosmic emergency service, it is an ongoing attempt to produce, in each generation, a person capable of holding all 4 elemental truths at once without reducing any of them to the others. Most avatars don't fully succeed. Most have an element they're most comfortable in, biases that complicate their supposed universality, national loyalties that pull in specific directions. The Avatar cycle is an experiment in human possibility running for 10,000 years, and the results are, as all experiments in human possibility tend to be, mixed and partial and magnificent in their incompleteness. Aang's particular position, the last of his people, with no nation to return to, his air nomad identity, the only uncompromised piece of who he is, gives him a freedom that other avatars rarely had. He cannot choose to be only an air nomad avatar because the air nomads are gone. He has to be the avatar in a more complete sense than someone who has a homeland to return to, a people to be accountable to. His orphaning, as catastrophic as it is, removes a constraint. He is forced to belong to the whole world, because there is no part of it left to claim exclusively. The spiritual dimension of bending is most visible in the moments when a bender's emotional state directly affects their capacity. This is not only dramatic convention, it is the show's consistent and carefully maintained mechanics. Firebenders who fuel their bending with rage generate enormous power, but lose precision. Waterbenders connected to the moon are limited by the moon's cycle. Earthbenders who cannot stand firm in their own sense of self cannot stand firm in their fighting stance either. The element always tells the truth about the person wielding it. This is why Zuko's firebending weakens in the 3rd season when his anger goes quiet. The anger was his fuel, and the fuel ran out when the thing generating it, the desperate need to earn his father's approval, lost its urgency. He had to find a different source, a different relationship to fire. The old fuel had to run out completely before the new source could begin. What the dragons showed him, the fire that was all colors, that moved with something recognizable as intelligence and tenderness, that felt less like a weapon and more like a living thing trying to communicate, is what fire was before the 100-Year War taught an entire nation to understand it only as a weapon. The original firebenders were not destroyers. They were speakers of a very old and very expressive language. What they said with it was complex enough to require multiple colors to contain. Closing why the world still holds. If you have followed this far through the pre-war world and the air nomads' lost civilization and the Avatar cycle's 10,000-year experiment and the spirit world's ancient and complicated residents, and the war's full history and two siblings shaped by fire, and a secret brotherhood built around a board game, and the most layered character in animation, and the real martial arts underneath every bending sequence, and the elemental extensions that reveal what power actually is, then you have spent considerable time inside a world built to reward exactly this kind of sustained attention. The creators made a world where the things you cannot see are doing just as much work as the things you can. Where the moon tracks a consistent lunar cycle through an entire season of television, its phase changing correctly episode by episode, so that when the full moon amplifies waterbending at the siege of the North Pole, it is the logical consequence of a cycle the show has been faithfully depicting for 20-something episodes, rather than a convenient plot device. Where a blind girl sleeps with her feet elevated in every camping scene because her feet are her eyes and touching the earth means she cannot rest, and the show never draws your attention to this, never explains it, simply includes it because it is true to who she is, and a world built with that kind of care includes details that are true even when no one is watching. Where the Chinese calligraphy in the background of every frame on every wanted poster, every shop sign, every decorative scroll in every background of every episode is real classical Chinese script brushed by an actual scholar who spent 3 seasons making sure a children's cartoon had more authentic calligraphy than most live-action films set in Asia. None of this required the audience to notice. None of it was included because it would help the show reach a wider audience or satisfy a studio requirement. It was included because the people who made it believed that a world built with that much care would feel different from a world built carelessly, even if no viewer could articulate exactly why. That the invisible things do their work in the invisible layer of experience, in the part of the mind that processes pattern without naming it, accumulating over 61 episodes into something that feels less like watching a show and more like visiting somewhere. You feel the invisible architecture without seeing it. You absorb it without knowing it exists. And then someone tells you that the airbending forms are based on a real martial art called Baguazhang, or that Toph sleeps with her feet up because that is how she closes her eyes, or that the moon phases track correctly through an entire season. And the reaction is not surprise, it is recognition. Of course, it could not be any other way. This is the mark of genuine craft. Not the visible kind, not the kind that announces itself and waits to be admired, the invisible kind. The kind that makes a world feel real without you ever being fully able to explain why it feels real. The world of Avatar was built by people who believed that the work you do not see is the work that holds everything else together. That you owe the invisible layers as much care as the visible ones, because the invisible layers are the foundation. That a children's cartoon on a Saturday afternoon can be a work of art if you are willing to do the work. That the level of detail that a great work of art demands is not a different category from the level of detail that a children's show requires. That children deserve the same rigor, and the same respect, and the same care that any audience deserves, and perhaps more, because what children absorb becomes the shape of the world they carry into adulthood. The calligraphy you cannot read makes the world feel older. The martial art you cannot name makes the fighting feel real. The lunar cycle you did not track makes the siege of the North feel inevitable. None of these details taken individually would change anyone's experience of the show. But taken together, accumulated over 61 episodes, absorbed unconsciously through the eyes and ears and the part of the brain that processes pattern without articulating it, they create something that no single detail could create on its own. The feeling of a world. And that feeling, that sense of immersion, that conviction that what you are watching is not a drawing but a place, is not an accident. It is the thing the show was designed to produce. The hidden facts are not extras. The invisible architecture is what holds the visible world together. And the reason Avatar endures, the reason people who were 7 years old when it aired are still watching it in their late 20s and finding new things, is that the world has enough in it to meet every version of you that ever sits down to watch. The 6-year-old sees adventure. The 16-year-old sees the philosophy. The 26-year-old sees the craft. The 36-year-old sees all three at once, and beneath them something that has no name, the feeling of a world that was loved into existence by the people who built it. That feeling doesn't fade. If anything, it deepens. Because the more you understand about how the world was made, the more remarkable it becomes that it was made at all. Two men, a pitch meeting, a sketch of a bald figure that was once a robot, a documentary about polar exploration playing in the same room, and from that origin, all of this. A world where the wind moves through 4 empty temples on high cliffs and, even though no one is there, exactly what it used to sound like when the people who lived there moved with it. Rest now, the world will be here when you wake up. If this kind of deep, unhurried time spent inside a world that deserves it is something you want more of, subscribing helps keep it coming. It genuinely does. And leave a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is. There is something that feels right about knowing this reached you, wherever you are, at whatever hour the night has found you in. Sleep well. The world was built to last. Bonus deep dives, the details that change everything. There is a certain point in any long and careful examination of Avatar where you realize the show was not simply well made. It was constructed with something closer to a moral position about the relationship between the maker and the made. Not a position stated in a manifesto or defended in interviews in abstract terms, but enacted in every small decision that didn't have to be made the careful way and was made the careful way anyway. This section is about some of those decisions, the ones that didn't have to be there, the ones that are there because someone cared enough to put them there. The music has its own geography. Jeremy Zuckerman, the composer of Avatar's score, did not write one unified musical language for the show. He wrote 4. Each nation has its own distinct musical palette, built from instruments and traditions associated with the real-world cultures that each nation drew from. And the choice of what you hear in any given scene tells you as much about where you are in the world as the animation itself. The Water Tribe themes use woodwinds and drums that draw from Inuit and Arctic indigenous musical traditions, instruments that feel ancient and cold and intimately connected to the natural world in a way that matches the water tribe's relationship to the sea. The Earth Kingdom uses instruments associated with Chinese classical music, the erhu, the guqin, the pipa strings that carry the weight of a very old civilization. The Fire Nation uses taiko drums and brass, military, driving, built for ceremony and for combat in equal measure. The Air Nomads, who appear only in flashbacks and in the rare moments of sustained peace that the show allows, are scored with Tibetan singing bowls and bamboo flutes, the most spiritual palette in the show, instruments that suggest meditation and altitude and a relationship to silence that the other nations never quite achieve. When Aang enters the Avatar state, when all 4 nations are present in one body, Zuckerman wrote all 4 palettes converging into a single dissonant chord. Not harmonizing, colliding. The music tells you at the moment the Avatar state activates that what you are hearing is the sound of 4 distinct histories and 4 distinct ways of understanding the world trying to occupy the same space simultaneously. It is not beautiful in the conventional sense. It is something more true than beautiful. It is what it actually sounds like when everything that has ever been the Avatar tries to move through one throat at once. This level of compositional intention maintained across 3 seasons and 61 episodes, across battles and quiet moments and comedic asides, and the most devastating grief the show produces, is not the kind of thing that happens by accident. It requires a composer who understood the show's philosophy well enough to express it in sound, working with creators who cared enough about music to give the composer the brief and the freedom to do it properly. The scar as a camera. Zuko's scar is one of the most recognizable visual signatures in animation. The mark his father burned into his face at 13 years old for the crime of showing compassion and refusing to fight a general his father had designated as his opponent in an Agni Kai. A refusal Ozai read as weakness and punished as such is always present, always visible, always part of the composition of whatever scene he is in. The storyboard artists turned it into a storytelling tool that operates below the level of conscious awareness for most viewers. In scenes where Zuko is acting from shame, from anger, from the version of himself his father tried to build, the camera shows the scarred side of his face. The damaged half is what the framing foregrounds. In scenes where he is showing vulnerability, compassion, the self he is moving toward rather than the self he was shaped into the camera shows the unscarred side. The undamaged half is what the composition privileges. This convention is maintained with remarkable consistency across 3 seasons. Watch for it the next time you rewatch the show. You will begin to notice it within a few episodes, and once you notice it, it becomes impossible to unknow. Every time Zuko appears on screen, the camera is making a choice about which version of him you are being shown, and that choice is being communicated through the simple geometry of which side of his face is in the frame. The scar is the show's most elegant piece of visual shorthand. Not because it simplifies Zuko, if anything, the convention reveals his complexity more deeply than any dialogue could, but because it makes his internal state visible without externalizing it. Zuko never says, "I am acting from shame right now." The camera says it for him, quietly, in the space between the framing and your unconscious perception of that framing. Toph's sleeping position. In almost every episode in which Team Avatar camps for the night, if you look at where Toph is sleeping, you will find that her feet are not touching the ground. She props them against a rock, against a raised ridge of earth, against a tree root, against anything that elevates her soles above the surface she's sleeping on. The show never explains this. No character comments on it. It is simply there, in episode after episode, as consistent and as quiet as the lunar cycle tracking through the background of Book 1. The reason is this. Toph sees through earthbending. Her seismic sense detects vibrations through the soles of her feet, extending her perception through the earth in all directions around her. When she is awake, this is her primary perceptual tool. She knows where you are, not by looking at you, but by feeling the way the earth transmits the vibration of your footfall. She knows the texture of the terrain around her by the way it carries signal. She knows when someone is lying because the body's physical response to deception produces subtle changes in pulse and tension that the earth communicates to her through the soles of her feet. When Toph is sleeping, she cannot use this perception to process information and simultaneously rest. If her feet are touching the ground, she can feel every footstep within her range, every insect moving through the soil, every person turning in their sleep. Lifting her feet off the ground is the equivalent for Toph of closing her eyes. It is how she turns off her vision so she can actually rest. The animators included this detail in almost every camping scene across 3 seasons. Nobody points it out, nobody makes it a scene. It is just there, accurate to who she is, in the background, doing its quiet work of making the world feel consistent and real. The cabbage merchant and what he means. The cabbage merchant, the recurring figure whose vegetable cart is destroyed in increasingly inventive ways, in nearly every city that Team Avatar visits, is almost universally remembered as a running joke. He is that. But he is also something more specific, and understanding what makes him one of the show's most quietly purposeful structural decisions. The Avatar world is not just a stage on which the main characters move. It is a world with millions of ordinary people, living ordinary lives, conducting ordinary business, following their own trajectories through the same geography that Team Avatar is crossing. The cabbage merchant, appearing in Omashu and in Ba Sing Se and at the North Pole and in various other locations, is the show's way of reminding you of this. He has no bending ability. He has no connection to the political events reshaping the world. He is a man who sells cabbages and whose cabbages keep getting destroyed by the people who are in the middle of reshaping the world. His persistence, the way he keeps showing up, keeps setting up his cart, keeps being in whatever city the group is visiting despite having no apparent means of rapid travel, is the show's deadpan acknowledgement that ordinary people are also moving through this world. That there are lives happening adjacent to the Avatar's journey that the show doesn't have time to follow but that are real. The cabbage merchant's narrative purpose is to represent the entire category of people whose stories are happening just off screen, who exist in the world fully even when the camera isn't on them. And his cabbages keep getting destroyed because the Avatar's journey, whatever its cosmic significance, is genuinely inconvenient for anyone who happens to be nearby. The lunar cycle in Book 1. This one requires going back and watching Book 1's nighttime scenes in sequence, because the payoff is cumulative and the mechanism is invisible until you know what to look for. The animators tracked the lunar cycle across Book 1. Every nighttime scene that shows the moon shows the correct phase of the moon for the episode's position in the timeline. The moon grows from a crescent in the early episodes, reaches full and waxes full, recedes, and approaches full again over the course of the season. This is not approximate. It is consistent with a single lunar cycle extending across the timeline of Book 1. The Siege of the Northern Water Tribe, in which the full moon dramatically amplifies the waterbender's power and plays a crucial role in the climax, takes place at a full moon because that is when the story reaches it. Not as a convenient narrative device, but as the logical consequence of a lunar cycle the show has been faithfully depicting across the entire season. The full moon at the siege is not chosen for dramatic convenience. It was always going to be a full moon at that point in the timeline, because that is where the full moon fell on the cycle the animators were tracking. The vast majority of viewers never notice this. The information is not consciously absorbed, but it is registered, somewhere below conscious awareness, as part of what makes the world feel internally consistent. The moon behaves like a moon. The world follows rules even when it is not explaining those rules to you. This is the kind of detail that cost real effort someone had. To track the lunar cycle, apply it to the timeline, check it against the nighttime scenes, maintain it across an entire season of production, and that almost no viewer will ever articulate. It is done not for credit but for the same reason all the other invisible things are done. Because the world is more real when it follows its own rules, and a world that is more real produces a more complete and lasting experience for the people inside it. The sound design of the elements. The sound design of Avatar is as carefully layered as its visual design, and it operates by the same principle. Each element has its own sonic identity, and that identity changes depending on the emotional and intentional quality of the bending producing it. Waterbending has a liquid, flowing quality created by manipulating recordings of actual water in actual motion rivers, waterfalls, the specific percussion of water being directed through air. The sound is not a generic water sound from a library. It was designed specifically for the show, and it changes depending on what the waterbender is doing and how they are doing it. Katara's gentle healing bending sounds different from her combat bending. Her combat bending sounds different at the height of her skill than it did in the early episodes. The sound grows with the character. Earthbending uses the heavy percussive sounds of stone and gravel-deep impacts, the grinding of rock against rock, the specific bass frequencies that very large things moving make when they move. The sound is heavy in a way that registers in the chest as much as in the ears, which matches the earthbending philosophy of weight and rootedness. Firebending incorporates gas ignition, furnace blasts, and the crackling of open flame, combined into something that feels both controlled and volatile, because firebending is both of those things simultaneously, always on the edge between the controlled and the uncontrolled, the directed and the destructive. Airbending is the subtlest. Wind recordings, processed to have a slightly musical quality, as if the air itself is generating something just below the threshold of melody. The sound suggests the element's relationship to breath, to music, to the invisible medium through which sound itself travels. The airbending sound is the only bending sound that is also, in a faint and formal way, a voice. When the avatar state activates, all four sounds are present simultaneously in the audio mix, competing and merging and separating, creating a texture that is unlike any of the individual elements, and unlike any other sound in the show. The music Zuckerman composed converges on that moment. The bending sounds converge on that moment. The visual elements converge on that moment. The avatar state is, in the full sensory experience of watching the show, the one place where everything the show knows how to do arrives at the same time. Why Iroh's tea matters more than you think. Iroh offers tea to virtually everyone he encounters in the series. To friends, to enemies, to people who are actively trying to capture or kill him. He makes tea in prison, using whatever he can find. He makes tea in hiding, in a tea shop in Ba Sing Se, in the spirit world after his death. Tea is as fundamental to his characterization as his firebending, possibly more so. In East Asian traditions, and the show is drawing specifically from Chinese and Japanese tea culture, tea carries philosophical weight that Western usage doesn't fully convey. The Chinese tradition of gongfu tea and the Japanese tea ceremony chado, or the way of tea, are both meditative practices. They ask for presence. They require attention to the immediate, the quality of the water, the temperature, the specific mood of this particular moment. Tea is not just a beverage in these traditions. It is a practice of being here, now, with what is in front of you. This is Iroh's philosophy made physical and repeated every time he offers someone a cup. He is saying, in the middle of everything that is wrong with the world, this moment is real. This warmth exists. This small human act of sharing something that requires care to make well, this is what civilization actually is. Not conquest, not military dominance, not the accumulation of power. Two people and something warm between them, made by someone who cared enough to do it properly. The Jasmine Dragon, the tea shop that Iroh opens in Ba Sing Se, and that becomes one of the show's most significant locations, is named after a real variety of tea. Jasmine Dragon Pearl Tea is a high-quality Chinese green tea, scented with jasmine blossoms and hand-rolled into small spheres that unfurl slowly in hot water. It is a tea associated with patience, with the appreciation of subtlety, with the kind of attention to small pleasures that requires you to slow down enough to notice them. The choice of name for Iroh's shop is not random. It is a reference to a real tea tradition chosen because it matches the values of the person who named it. Even the fictional tea shop in a fantasy world is named after something real, because the show could not imagine doing it any other way. The 100 Names of Aang. Aang is the only character in the show who never fully settles into a single mode of being. He is playful and he is burdened. He is ancient 10,000 years of avatars in his lineage, and he is 12. He is the last of his people and the guardian of everyone. He refuses to kill and carries the responsibility of a world that may require killing. He meditates for hours and rides his air scooter through Ba Sing Se's streets because he has not yet learned to resist the impulse toward joy. The show does not resolve these contradictions, it holds them. It allows Aang to be all of these things simultaneously, which is not a narrative convenience but an accurate observation about what it looks like to be a person who has been given a role before they were equipped to understand what it would cost them. The Avatar state is the site where the contradictions are most visible. When Aang enters it, he ceases, for the duration, to be 12-year-old Aang. He becomes the accumulated avatar all the people Rava has carried, all the learning, all the power. He becomes capable of things that are, physically and spiritually, beyond him. And when he comes out of the state, he is Aang again, the 12-year-old, the last air nomad, the boy who misses Gyatso and thinks turtle ducks are wonderful and doesn't want to hurt anyone. The show's most honest insight about what the Avatar is might be this. The Avatar is the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years, trying to find its way through the limitations of one person's specific and irreducible humanity. The power is real. The wisdom is real, in the sense that it is available, but the person who carries it is still a person. With a person's capacity for fear and longing and joy and grief, and the particular exhaustion of being asked to be more than a person, while still being, in every way that matters, a person. This is not a flaw in the Avatar system. It is the system's most essential quality. A purely cosmic force could not mediate between nations, could not listen to the specific grievances of specific people, could not understand that the cabbage merchant exists and matters and is real. The Avatar has to be human to do what the Avatar does. The humanity is not the obstacle. The humanity is the point. The real world inside the fantasy. One of the questions that Avatar invites, without ever directly posing it, is what responsibility a work of art has to the cultures it draws from. The show is built on foundations that belong to real people, the martial arts traditions of China, the Tibetan Buddhist spirituality of the air nomads, the Inuit cultural practices of the water tribes, the imperial Chinese architecture of the Earth Kingdom, the Japanese aesthetic sensibility of the Fire Nation's pre-war buildings. These things were borrowed. The question is whether they were borrowed with care. The evidence, across 61 episodes, suggests that they were. The martial arts were not approximated. They were practiced by a real practitioner, who then provided real reference footage. The calligraphy was not invented. It was brushed by a real scholar, in real classical characters, with attention to the calligraphic style appropriate to each nation. The music was not generically Asian. It was built from specific instrumental traditions, with specific cultural associations, applied thoughtfully to the specific emotional and geographic contexts where they appeared. The creators have spoken in interviews about their intention to treat the source cultures as real rather than as props, to take from them what they offered in a spirit of genuine engagement rather than surface appropriation. Whether they fully succeeded at every point is a legitimate debate. What is not debatable is that the intention was present and that it produced a show that engages more carefully with the cultures it draws from than the vast majority of fantasy works that borrow from Asia. For children watching in 2005, this meant something specific and perhaps underappreciated. They were absorbing, without knowing they were absorbing it, a relationship to Asian cultures that was not the default relationship Western media offered at that time. They were learning what a Tai Chi form looks like, not because someone told them about Tai Chi, but because the waterbenders they loved moved that way. They were hearing what a Tibetan singing bowl sounds like, not in the context of an exotic music lesson, but in the context of a spiritual moment they found emotionally meaningful. They were encountering the concept of chakras, not as foreign mysticism, but as the framework that explained something important about a character they cared about. The show was planting seeds, giving children a relationship to these things before they had names for them. So that years later, when those children encountered the real things, a real Tai Chi class, a real Chinese temple, a real Tibetan monastery, the recognition would be there. Of course, I have been here before. Something taught me the shape of this before I knew what it was called. This is perhaps the deepest layer of what Avatar did. Not just entertaining, not just telling a great story with great characters, seeding curiosity, building a relationship across a generation of children, between those children and the cultures that the show drew from, a relationship not mediated by distance or exoticism or the othering that Western media had historically applied to Asian cultures, but by the love that the characters in the show had for their own traditions, by the love that the creators had for the real-world traditions they were drawing from, by the love that the children watching had for the world they were visiting, without knowing that the world was teaching them something about the real one. This is what a children's show can do when it is made with that level of care. Not just entertain, not just tell a good story, change the shape of what the children who watch it know, not through instruction but through immersion, through giving them a world to live in for a while that was built from the same materials as the real world, and letting them discover, later, that the materials were real all along. What the finale actually cost? The series finale of Avatar Sozin's Comet, produced as a 4-part television event with a combined runtime of approximately 92 minutes, resolves the central conflict of the series in a way that the show had been building toward for 3 seasons, while also doing something considerably more difficult. It refuses the easiest version of the resolution. Aang cannot kill Ozai. Not will not, philosophically though that is also true. Cannot, in the sense that killing Ozai would require Aang to become something that would destroy what he is, and what he is happens to be the thing the world most needs. His air nomad heritage, his vegetarianism, his deep-rooted commitment to non-harm are not optional features of his character. They are the features. They are who he is, entirely. And a version of Aang who kills the Fire Lord is no longer recognizably Aang. The show commits to this. It does not give him an easy out. The lion turtle does not arrive to offer the energy-bending option in the first act so that the moral weight of the choice is diffused across the whole finale. The option arrives late, when the alternatives have become genuinely desperate. Aang enters the final confrontation with Ozai without having fully resolved how he will handle it. The resolution comes in the fight itself. Through the specific confluence of circumstances, Ozai pushing him against a rock, the spinal impact freeing the locked energy in his chakras, the avatar state activating fully for the first time since Ba Sing Se, that produces the clarity about what he is actually capable of. He removes Ozai's bending. He does not kill him. He finds the third option that the show had been insisting, against all narrative pressure, might exist. This matters because the show could have taken the easier path at several points. It could have had Ozai do something so extreme that killing him became clearly justified. It could have had a character Aang trusts tell him that killing is sometimes necessary and that this is one of those times. It could have found a way to make the moral calculation simpler. It chose not to. It committed, completely and without consolation prize, to the idea that Aang's pacifism was not a quirk to be overcome but a principle to be honored even when honoring it costs the most. The cost of honoring it is that the finale's climax is less cinematically satisfying than a climactic battle would be. The energy-bending scene is quiet and strange and looks nothing like any other fight in the series. It is not what you expect from the moment a 3-season story arc resolves. It is, in some ways, deeply anticlimactic. And this is exactly the point. The show chose to be right over being satisfying. It chose Aang's truth over the genre's convenience. And the audience, which had been trained for 3 seasons to love and trust Aang's particular kind of goodness, recognized and accepted this, even if the shape of the moment was not the shape they had imagined. This is what it costs to make a show that takes its characters seriously. The character's truth becomes more binding than the story's convenience. You are no longer free to make the ending easy. The weight of being last. Aang is, for most of the show, the last air nomad, the only surviving representative of a civilization that was deliberately, systematically, and completely destroyed. This is a form of loss that has no ordinary framework, no support network, no community of people who understand from the inside, no living tradition to return to, no elders to ask what the correct grief looks like. He is also 12. He carries this not by compartmentalizing. The show does not let him compartmentalize, even when he tries, but by moving, by being present to the people around him, and the moments in front of him, and the immediate sensory pleasures of a world that is often beautiful even when it is terrible. He meditates, he plays, he is sometimes suddenly, overwhelmingly sad in ways that come out of nowhere, triggered by things that seem small from the outside, because grief does not announce itself on a schedule. The show's treatment of his trauma is, across 3 seasons, among the most psychologically accurate things it does. He avoids certain subjects. He has emotional flashbacks in specific contexts, seeing Fire Nation soldiers, encountering Air Temple ruins, hearing the wind in a particular way. He oscillates between the numbness that comes from having processed too much too fast and the sudden, overwhelming swell that comes from the things you couldn't afford to feel in the moment finally arriving. He is simultaneously older than 12 in his capacity for responsibility and genuinely 12 in his capacity for ordinary human response to what he has been through. The weight of being last is not just the grief for what was lost. It is the specific pressure of knowing that every choice you make is, in some sense, the choice of an entire culture that can no longer make choices for itself. Every time Aang maintains his vegetarianism, it is an act of cultural preservation. Every time he meditates, every time he plays with Momo, every time he teaches someone an Air Nomad game or tells an Air Nomad story, he is doing the work of a tradition rather than simply the work of a person. The personal and the cultural are, for him, inseparable in a way that most people never experience. This is also what makes him the right avatar for this moment in the world's history. A person for whom the destruction of culture is not abstract, who carries the evidence of it in the specific texture of his own daily life, is perhaps the person most suited to understanding what the Fire Nation's war has cost the world beyond the political. Not just territory, not just power, lives, yes, but also the things that lives carried, the songs, the games, the specific way the light looked through meditation hall windows in the early morning, the sound of many people who all knew the same language speaking it together. These are the things you cannot restore with a treaty. These are the things that Aang, alive and remembering, carries forward, imperfectly and incompletely, into a world that will have to find its own relationship to what it lost. He tries. Every day of the show, in ways large and small, he tries. And in the end, this is perhaps the most honest thing the show says, that trying is what is possible. That the loss is real, and the grief is real, and the world is also still here, and it is possible, even in the middle of all of that, to make something that was not there before. Something small, maybe. A moment of kindness. A preserved tradition. A world slightly more balanced than the one that handed the problem to you. It is enough. It has to be enough. The show trusts that you know it is enough, because the show trusts its audience, finally and completely, to understand that the imperfect and ongoing attempt is what dignity looks like. Rest now. The world is still here, and it was always, always worth caring about.